Janet, and I know that your thesis that you're writing now is about women in leadership in the civil rights movement, so I think we can expect to hear a little bit of that from you as well.
Yes, but first of all, I wanted to say how honored and humbled I am to be on the panel with Ivanhoe Donaldson. I just have the greatest respect for him. Obi-Wan Kenobi of this civil rights movement, and particularly the student involvement. The civil rights movement, as Ivanhoe has indicated, was very deep and wide, and he hinted at so many concepts it's hard to follow if you have not been able to read all the materials, and even if you have been. I was a latecomer to the civil rights movement, having grown up in Erie, Pennsylvania, graduated from high school in 1964, and went south, worked in Virginia starting in 1965 and 66 with Virginia Student Rights Committee, because I happened to be involved with someone who was a student at the University of Virginia. And I later worked for the Southern Students Organizing Committee, living in Nashville, Tennessee for about a year and a half, also living in Southside, Virginia. And Southside, Virginia, for those of you who don't know, it's a very, if you talk about apartheid, really reminiscent of the apartheid part of the global South in South Africa. I mean, it was so bad that when the schools were integrated there, rather than let the students go to school together, they shut down the school for 5 years. So all of the white students went to, quote, private academies, which were paid for primarily with public funds. The black students, if they got a chance to be educated at all, were sent to other places outside of that area so they could go to school. What I want people really to know, what I've discovered in talking with young people, is when we say the words Jim Crow, what does that mean to you? And you're all much younger than I am, including Miles. What does Jim Crow mean? Anybody?
Institutional racism.
Oh, that's it. Okay. Economic, political, social oppression. It was slavery by another name, in the sense that people were totally oppressed and were forbidden to have social contact in a way that should be the case. And some might argue that there's still some of that today. Part of my research that Miles alluded to, the reason I'm focusing on African American women in the civil rights movement is not to have any division between the women and the men, but to lift up those lessons learned from those women, and also to just show the respect that they should have, because many women, who I would call leaders, and my definition of leadership is very inclusive. You don't have to be head of an organization. You don't have to have a position that's normally recognized as leaders, as a leadership position. But as far as I'm concerned, there's such concepts as leading from the middle of the pack and servant leadership. One could argue that Martin Luther King was indeed a servant leader because he answered the call in many ways. So the women that I have been studying for the last 7 years really represent a lot of things. They represent this concept of indigenous leadership primarily. Indigenous meaning that they are part of their communities. They've grown out of their communities. They've taken responsibility at different levels. In Montgomery, for instance, in the bus boycott, who do you think of when you think of as a woman leader in the Montgomery bus boycott?
Joanne Robinson.
Pardon?
Joanne Robinson.
Okay, very good. You know Joanne Robinson, Women's Political Council, who was at the local college there, who helped organize the transportation system, because if people couldn't go to work, they had no money. There was no such thing as workers' comp and things like that. So Joanne Robinson, tell me another one. Someone else. Okay, so
Rosa Parks.
Rosa Parks, of course, she's an obvious person that most people know, but have you heard of Claudette Colvin? Claudette Colvin, okay, you're a historian. Okay, tell us who Claudette Colvin was. Come on, show off.
She was actually the person who sat on the bus before Rosa Parks.
About a year.
A teenage unwed mother, and she didn't fit the middle class profile that NCP wanted to sort of project to promote. And so they basically sort of sidelined her case and promoted and projected Rosa Parks.
Right, but she was one of the named plaintiffs on a suit which eventually ended the segregation, legally ended the segregation of the bus system there. But, and then there was, okay, all right. Okay, who was Georgia Gilmore? Okay, Georgia Gilmore. I want some platinum stars going on here. You know Georgia Gilmore? She was a cook. And what she did was she organized what she called the Club from Nowhere. They didn't give it a name because they didn't want to be identified so tightly. And what they did was they did like many of our mothers and aunties did. They sold goods, raised money, and gave them to the struggle, gave them for the civil rights movement. So in my definition of leadership, I fit in Rosa Parks, Joanne Robinson, Claudette Colvin, Georgia Gilmore. So I have a very expansive definition there. The concept of person power is very strong, particularly when it comes to women leadership, because we didn't have titles, or they didn't have titles. And an interesting thing, I've done several interviews for my dissertation. I'm all but dissertation doctoral candidate. I'm waiting to join you. And each person I talked to, the very first thing they said is, I was not a leader. And I said, let's talk about that a little bit more. What did you do? And I said, well, I beg to differ with you because you exhibited leadership at the way we look at it and the way the Antioch University Leadership and Change Program looks at it. You fit in the definition of leadership. And I want to lift that up because it shows that there's a multiplicity of leadership. And I think that in doing that, in showing how we can lead at all different levels, how Ivanhoe as a student could go from Michigan and go down south and do these amazing kinds of things, it shows that that you don't have to wait for someone to tell you you're a leader. And that's a lesson I want people to learn, that you take ownership, you take responsibility, and you find a niche and you fill it, because there's a lot of good work to do. I wanted to say just a couple more things. One about rural women, exemplified by Fannie Lou Hamer. And you've had the readings on Fannie Lou Hamer. I know everyone's busy. You may not have had a chance to read it. But rural women, as well as women in the cities, but particularly rural women who joined the movement. Let me set the picture for you how dangerous that was. First of all, you're isolated. Secondly, you can lose any relationships you have with the person for whom you are sharecropping, and they did. You were subject already to indignities that many of us cannot even imagine in some ways. My grandmother, who lived, and my mother, who grew up in rural Arkansas, about 100 miles from Little Rock, who, when she got of age, could not go to high school because there was no high school for black kids. She had, her two older sisters went the 100 miles to Little Rock to go to school. My mother never went. My mother stopped at 8th grade because she could never go to high school. But a quick story about my grandmother, who didn't take no stuff when it came to her daughters. She had 3 daughters. And in those days, black women were open season. They were open season. It was a right of people to just come in and either fondle them or do what have you. And my grandmother, who's actually shorter than I am, about 4'11", she weighed less than 100 pounds, could drag a 100-pound sack of cotton in the cotton fields. So when people talked about people being shiftless and lazy, I said, who in the world are they talking about? Anyway, the insurance people would come around, and they would sell these insurance policies on a weekly basis. And one guy didn't get the word that you did not mess with Sophronia McKnight's daughters. So he came in, and he fondled my aunt, my mother's sister. And my grandmother, all 4'11" of her and less than 100 pounds, just calmly walks up, goes over, gets a shotgun, and then shoots it. The bullet passes his ear by about 1 inch, intentionally. And then, you know what she did after that? So the guy, of course, left. He wasn't totally stupid. So he leaves. And as soon as he leaves, my mother sends her 3 daughters away because she was afraid that she had opened them to being murdered. That's the kind of area they lived in. And my grandfather, the most beautiful man I ever knew until I met Derek Bell, they stayed there waiting for the inevitable. And they waited, and they waited, and nobody came. And about 2 weeks later, another white insurance salesman came, and he said, Aunt Sophronia, and as if nothing had ever happened. So they were among the lucky ones. But some people, like in the case of Emmett Till, they come to your door, they take you away, they never see you again. Or the case of so many unknown people who are like that. So it was a dangerous time. It was not as clean as you see it, even on, I mean, they show you the dogs, they show you all those things on Eyes on the Prize and various other things, but people had to exhibit extraordinary courage and vision and a kind of stamina for which we should all be very, very grateful. Thank you, Ivanhoe.